Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. So I'm very excited, folks, to have a special guest on who's come on once before. Um, I had talked about how us little guys got to stick together. And so Robert from Book of Mormon Editions, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me back. I'm honored. I guess I did a good enough time the first time to be invited back, so that's an honor.
Well, and doing the shout out video really helped too. So yeah, Robert did a really cool shout out video, which forced my hand because I had the interview I did with him in the inventory, and I'm like, oh, okay. So I said, okay, dude, you're up next. You're slotted.
All right,
And
good.
so he did So Robert is a YouTuber, and tell us the name of your channel and a little bit of what it's about.
So my YouTube channel is called Book of Mormon Editions, and where my phrase is we discuss printings, publications, and various editions of the Book of Mormon. And it kind of morphed and started with my own personal collection. I was a book collector of editions of the Book of Mormon, and I was looking to try to find how to look at a specific edition, and there was no book review on it. And so I decided to start doing some videos on how to collect an edition, or this is what you look for when you look for a specific edition. And it seems like everyone does mechanics videos and things like that. No one did a book review on editions of the Book of Mormon. So I thought it would be pretty interesting for me to do videos on it. So my videos is usually one video per edition of the Book of Mormon. So that way you can get a general sense of if you want to collect it and then what's inside it. And then also, it's also morphed in talking about who the publishers are or why it was printed in the first place.
And so I think what we're going to do is this is kind of a collaboration, and I think we're going to call this episode "Unusual Book of Mormon Editions" or something along that line. And
Yeah.
now, in one sense, to Robert and I, they're not very unusual because we're steeped in this world. But to many of my viewers who are of a particular branch of the Restoration, they may only be familiar with their particular Book of Mormon and maybe the main branch, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints editions. And so we thought, let's just have a little conversation about some of our, as you all know, I did a book reviews, an evangelical reviews his Books of Mormon edition, and I'm going to probably do a part 2 because I'm going to discuss some of the new acquisitions of my collection. And so let's just start talking about our unusual editions of the Book of Mormon. Robert, what do you got lined up for me here?
Well, for some background as well.
Sure.
It's been interesting as the calculations that I ran through and all of the publications of news stories around, hey, we're printing a new edition of the Book of Mormon, things like that. In terms of context, 90% of all editions of the Book of Mormon has been published through or been influenced by Salt Lake Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I mean, the missionary Book of Mormon is massive in terms of its quantity printed. And so of that 90%, I would say, 80% of the Salt Lake editions are missionary Book of Mormons. And then the other ones are like commentaries and, various Deseret book study guides, things like that. And so because of it, it's kind of interesting. The real fun part is the 10% of non-Salt Lake editions or, unusual books that kind of make it. So I don't mean to spend 90% of my time on Salt Lake missionary editions because that'd be pretty boring. And so it's really the fun, fringe, not say fringe, but like the lesser known editions that are just as important and worthy of videos.
Yeah, and that's the cool part about all this is that a lot of different various branches in the Restoration have come up with, and there have been people who have come up with their own translations and editions, as a kind of a just something they do just because they love the Book of Mormon, and
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. Sometimes it tells you a lot about the person who did the translation as well as the organization. Perhaps they took different directions in retranslating, if you will, or maybe making corrections in their mind to the text, and it often is reflective of that movement and their beliefs, and of course on my side, and I think we discussed this in our last interview, is that we tend to come up with a new translation of the Bible about every 6 months or so. And it's often reflective of the individual and the organization that's putting out that publication. So it's a similar parallel that we have in our particular religious traditions.
So the other part, interesting, some church history is, oh, originally the editions that we talk about that are foundational editions is obviously the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. This was like a reprint, and let's see if that. So this is kind of what it looks like in terms of an 1830 reprint edition. So everyone loves these 1830 copies of the Book of Mormon.
And just so you know, here's my copy. I think we got the same RLDS edition there.
Yeah, so in the 1970s, the RLDS group came out, but some history behind that is there was a gentleman by the name of Wilfred Wood who went back to Palmyra and actually collected some of the printing sheets and various details. And he printed one, where is it? He printed one called Joseph Smith Begins His Work.
Oh, wow.
And it's by Wilfred Wood. And this is one of the first replicas of an 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. And it was printed in like the 50s, 60s. And he was actually the one who got the, what's called?
The printer's manuscript?
Yeah, no, not the printer's manuscript, but pamphlets, like the 16 pages folded down. And he got those and gave them to the church, and then also photocopied, but like imaged them so that he created like a first replica of an 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. So
when you say pamphlets, what do you mean? 16-page pamphlets?
Okay, they're called signatures. And the signatures, basically, instead of it printing like a 5x6, you'd print like a 20 by 30 page of paper. And
oh, wow.
It'd be on this kind of sheet of paper, and you print both sides, and then it'd fold it down.
Huh.
Then you'd stitch that edge into your binding, and then you'd trim the edges, and that way you'd have 16 pages instead of printing one page at a time. You'd actually print 16 pages on a signature page, a signature pamphlet.
Now, was that put out by somebody from the RLDS or from the LDS Church?
So this was out of the Palmyra edition of the Book of Mormon. So these guys did pretty good in terms of researching the paper, the weight, the size, what it looked like, and did a pretty good edition of the Book of Mormon. And so often they have these little signature pages or the signature pamphlets that you can get that are still uncut and unstitched.
And so the guy who did the edition in the 1950s, that was what he was working off of?
Yeah, so there was a couple of these extra from the printer or left over in collectors. And so he got these signature pamphlets and gave them to the church, and then did a reprint. So it's by Wilfred Wood. And if you do kind of some history, Wilfred Wood was a researcher / collector. And Wilfred Wood did he was important in Palmyra to preserve some of the artifacts in Palmyra, or, the things like that he scrounged up. So the 1830 edition is, they're hard to come by. And I recognize that when they moved from Palmyra to Kirtland and Kirtland to Missouri, and then especially in Missouri with Hans Mill, and they almost left with, clothes on their backs to go to Nauvoo. Editions of the Book of Mormon were always ransacked and burned first by the mobs and things like that. And so Joseph Smith did an 1837 Kirtland edition. And then he also did, when he went into Nauvoo, in 1842 Nauvoo edition. So some fun trivia and history behind it is the 1842 edition from Nauvoo was the last edition that Joseph Smith touched. And so a lot of researchers like the 1842 edition because there were edits on each particular time. He would go through it and edit or do some clarity words updates. And so the 1842 was the last one that it did. What was interesting is Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles were called to be missionaries and left before everyone went to Nauvoo. And so Brigham Young took an 1837 Kirtland edition to England, and went to a printer in England and said, print me Book of Mormons for the England mission. And so your prints of 1800s England editions are from an 1837 Kirtland text rather than the updated 1842 text, which also means that when Brigham Young came back and helped the Saints move to Utah, he had the printing plates from England that brought with him. And so the Salt Lake texts were actually from an 1837 origination text that he, took and brought back from England. So your 1842 edition was the most updated, but unfortunately Brigham Young never was in that area. So he had a 1837 edition. So this is why your Salt Lake texts and your RLDS texts have some different text word differences. And so in the 1970s, when the RLDS Church and the Salt Lake Church were kind of getting together, the 1981 edition was one that they actually looked at the RLDS text and said, oh yeah, there is updates from 1842 Nauvoo. And that's why they did quite a few changes in the 1981 format. And so everyone modern time says, oh, it's so sensational that they made so many changes to the 1981 Book of Mormon. And unfortunately, it's not as sensational as critics think, because it just happened that this was the flow of which edition was used. And by 1981, they kind of collaborated to get a good updated 1981 edition.
So the 1981 edition is actually more in line with what Joseph Smith, where he wanted it to go.
Yeah, I think the Salt Lake Church is very comfortable, was very happy with the result of the 1981 printing. Yeah.
I just have a quick question, because you're LDS, and when the claim is made, this is the most correct book ever, but then all these changes were made. How do you respond to that?
Good question. And in the introduction, they say if there's any errors, it's the errors of men. And I think the most correct is that the message of the Book of Mormon is to come unto the Savior, come unto Jesus. And if you have an ability to read the Book of Mormon and draw closer to Jesus in a way that's different than any other avenue or any other mechanism, then that's what we're talking about, the most correct book. So I don't take too much I'm not too critical of edits, because, well, in the Book of Mormon, there's the word faggots is used, and that's actually for flames of flames of a fire, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so will that ever be changed to flames of a fire and not use that word because it's now such a weird word in today's modern language? Certainly. I don't know. Yeah. And so we do have a privilege of updating words if the meaning has changed over time, that we now need to correct the meaning back to what we want it to be. So,
and of course, the evangelicals just love to go after you guys, but we're the ones that are quote unquote making corrections to our Bible all the time. Yeah. We're supposedly the infallible, to believe it's infallible. So I think it's important that we just maybe be a little bit more respectful and a little more compassionate towards each other. Speaking of, okay, so now this is the fun part for Robert and I, because we have to be careful. Some of these are personal editions that people have, so we got to make sure we cover their names before we put them on camera. And so this is actually my latest acquisition. So just so you don't know, folks, yesterday I attended my very first Community of Christ service in the greater Bradenton, Sarasota Metroplex, let's just call it. And so I get there, and the night before I talked to the pastor of the church. She's a wonderful person, and she wasn't quite sure where I was coming from at first, but then we talked for a while, and then she realized, why don't you come to church tomorrow? And I said, I was going through my collection, and I realized I didn't have a Community of Christ edition of the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. How could I have slipped by? And so she said, you know what? I think I got an extra copy. I'll bring it. So I'm sitting in the pews, and this lady walks up, and she she sits down next to me, opens up her purse, and gives me this copy of the Book of Mormon. So this is the RLDS edition. This is based, I think, in the 1950s edition. And yeah, so this was copyright 1953. eighth printing, February 1971. Tell
Great.
me just a little bit about the RLDS Book of Mormon.
So the RLDS Book of Mormon was patterned after the 1842 Nauvoo edition that we talked about.
Yep.
And so when Joseph Smith III was asked to lead the reorganized church or so, they did a pretty good job in terms of organizing the people that didn't move to Utah. And so they printed one in, they printed an edition in 1874, and it's a 1874 edition of the Book of Mormon. But the thing is, they used this 1874 printing up through the 1890s. So it was printed and printed and printed with the 1874, let's say copyright by the 1804 printing stamp on it.
Yep.
And so the RLDS Church took that. What was significant in it about the turn of the century, David Whitmer's estate had the printer's manuscript from Oliver Cowdery. When Oliver Cowdery died, he was at the home of David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery had the printer's manuscript. And so in the 1900s, or the turn of the century of 1900, that family went to the RLDS Church and offered them the printer's manuscript. And that was a wonderful experience because the RLDS Church took that and made a 1908 printing of the Book of Mormon. And so your 1908 RLDS printing is a benchmark for referring back to the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. And so all of your 1900s books is from the 1908 edition. Shortly after, in the 1980s, the RLDS Church updated their doctrine a little bit, and in the year 2000, they changed to called the Community of Christ, I think. And they use this particular one right now, and this is, if you have it, it's Community of Christ. So it kind of just depends on when your book is printed. Usually they'll say the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or after 2000, they have Community of Christ as their printing publisher listing. So
now, didn't they also came out with an edition of the Book of Mormon in the 1960s that removed a lot of, and it came to pass? Of course you got it. Awesome.
This is interesting because the cover and the dust, this is the one with the dust cover, and the dust cover has some Reformed Egyptian on it. But the 1966 authorized edition had the RLDS Church, as mentioned, they took some liberty on taking out some and they came to passes. And there's a lot of and it came to passes that are just repeated on every phrase or every verse. And they said if it's redundant, they took it out. And once again, I'm not a critic of it. I think that they had a privilege of doing so if it meant that their readers could read better, easier, faster, or draw closer to the message with it. And that was fine for them. But yeah, they have, in the authorized current edition has a lot of and it came to pass phrases taken out.
Okay. Well, that's cool. That's cool to know. So I wanted to talk a little bit about one that's also based on this. So just to give you a little history, my friend Patrick McKay presented me this beautiful leather-bound edition of the Book of Mormon. It's the Restored Covenant edition, and it's printed by the Zarahemla Research Foundation. You have a copy of this, right? You did a review of this, right? And so I spoke at the Book of Mormon rally in Independence, Missouri last month, and he presented me this copy, which I am so honored by it.
Yeah.
And this, just to give you a little history, what they did was they use a lot of the 1908 edition, but they also made some changes and stuff and some corrections. I'll wash this out a little bit, but it's more set up in a poetic format. And they also do something that's unique to, well, it's becoming more common. We'll talk about that. But they have, this is also a red letter edition.
Yes. So red letter editions are words of the Savior. And in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in your traditional Bibles, they have all of your Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John words of the Savior in red letter. And it kind of highlights what Jesus said. And so when Book of Mormon has words of the Savior, especially in 3rd Nephi, it's really fun to see red letter editions in a Book of Mormon setting as well.
So one of my favorite things I like to do is go to an evangelical and open up 3rd Nephi and say, look at all this, dude. Look at all the words of Christ in red.
Yeah.
And I'm actually friends with someone who's currently a missionary. He just graduated from the MTC last month, and I'm in contact with him. And I told him about this edition. I said, man, you guys got to go and do your red letter editions, and you can go to evangelicals. He said, well, actually, they make us highlight them in red. I said, oh, of course they're gonna have the missionaries do that.
Yeah.
So it's a good exercise.
Yeah. So that one, the Zarahemla Research Foundation, is based out of Independence, Missouri. And they do pretty interesting. The Community of Christ did have some updates to their doctrine that some members always don't jive with. And so there's a few branches that have moved off called the Restoration branches. And so the Restoration branches adhere to some of the old foundational principles of the RLDS community. And so they use that Zarahemla Research Foundation. Another one is Price Publishing, that they have a 1908 reprint. And so it's useful if you don't want a Community of Christ edition, but you are in Independence, Missouri kind of area, or following that, there's a value on those Zarahemla Research Foundation editions.
Yeah, and it's a really cool edition, and it's really just fascinating to hear this history. And so, just so you know, the history a little bit is actually Patrick told me that his particular congregation was the very first congregation to leave in 1984 when the RLDS started going in a more mainline liberal Protestant direction. So he was there from the start. And so essentially these particular, they call them independent branches. Now, some of them have formed with a prophet who's a direct descendant often of Joseph Smith, and others have chosen not to formally have a prophet. They just have the highest office as apostle. And so basically all those groups use this edition and the 1908. That's just kind of, that's the context of that particular edition.
Yeah. So the Restoration branches either are, we, as mentioned, independent, or a few of them have kind of merged into, it's called the Restored.
There's Remnant.
Oh, Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So at this particular time, they're big enough, but they don't have their own edition of the Book of Mormon. So they do use that edition, and also the Price Publishing 1908 reprint. Sooner or later they'll make their own printing. So, but they don't. So,
have you talked to them actually about that?
A couple of times. Every year or so, I kind of check in with them to see how they're doing. Their first prophet was a direct descendant of Joseph Smith through a mother's line or something like that, and their next leader actually is not a direct descendant, and so it'll be interesting seeing in the next couple of years how they do. But at this particular time, the Remnant Church doesn't have an edition of the Book of Mormon printed.
So let's see. You got any other editions? I got mine's piled up. Why don't you throw one out there and let's talk about it?
I'll go back to Salt Lake. As mentioned, Salt Lake editions, most of them are missionary editions, but then there's either BYU professors or other church leaders or something like that do what I call study guide editions of the Book of Mormon. And often a lot of people love this one. And my wife kind of swears by this one. It's called Book of Mormon Made Easier. It's 3 volumes. And anytime a volume of the Book of Mormon is bigger than the Book of Mormon itself, there's a lot of stuff in it. But this is by David Ridges. And so a lot of your LDS community will have these 3 volumes in your study guide for study guide, or they'll be in their bookshelves for that. So Book of Mormon Made Easier. I haven't reviewed this one yet because I know it's just a lot of work in this, and compliment to him, but 3 volumes for the Book of Mormon means there's a lot more reading than just the Book of Mormon itself.
So what is it, like a commentary, or what exactly are they doing with the text?
The text is the Book of Mormon, and then it goes into commentary around significance around why that verse is there, or LDS general authority commentary, quotes about that particular verse or so. And so a lot of it, your study guides are the text of the Book of Mormon and then commentary around that particular text. So Book of Mormon Made Easier, but If it's more volume, I wonder if it's easier. So there you go.
So has that helped you? You said your wife really enjoys it. Has it helped you in your personal study of the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. So last year, the Salt Lake Church did like a heavy emphasis on the Book of Mormon. And so she read that Book of Mormon made easier while she was reading the Book of Mormon through the whole year. And she said that she really liked it. And it gave more clarity around why various phrases are there, or significant portions of that, in terms of more clarity around the Book of Mormon itself.
Oh, interesting. So I want to get back to doing commentaries, but I have a few I want to talk to you about too. But before we get into the commentary part, because we could probably do another episode about that, but I wanted to maybe just go on to a couple more editions that I have, and then we'll circle back. I wanted to show you this edition, which is you have, of course, this is the Book of Mormon from the Church of Jesus Christ, based in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. I finally figured out how to say Monongahela, by the way. I think that's how you say it, Pennsylvania. And I like to refer to them as the Pentecostal cousins of the Restoration.
Yeah.
2 Sundays ago, I was presented this by by Josh Gailey, who was a guest on my program. And then he said, and then we got the Songs of Zion hymn book coming on its way too, by the way, for you, Steve. So this is a really cool edition because it's also red letter. And this is actually similar to their missionary edition, except that this one's leather bound. I like how clear the
text is.
Yeah, the text is really easy to read. So
yeah, it's really good one. What was interesting about that one is their introduction says that they actually took several editions of the Book of Mormon. An 1830, a Salt Lake text, a 1908 edition, and like a couple of other significant ones, and kind of, let's say, did a collaboration, but did a cross comparison so that they printed their own edition from it. Unfortunately, that particular group didn't have original texts like Salt Lake or our LDS Church had, and so they actually had to take sources and kind of do a collaboration. So they did a pretty good job in terms of getting as best as they could with all of the sources they could to create their edition of the Book of Mormon. And I like the red letter feature on that one as well.
When was their first edition published of the Book of Mormon?
So this one is their, let's say, missionary edition, but it's their paperback edition. And it's just a red burgundy softcover edition. And I think, let's see.
I should text Josh Gailey right now and just say, hey, when was your first edition?
Hey, when was your first edition? I don't know. Okay. They don't have, maybe you can find in yours, but they don't have printing dates in the ones that they have.
Okay, so, yeah. So but did they print an edition in the 19th century?
Yes, I think like the ones that I have were refurbished or retexted in about the 1990s. And I think previous to that, they had, editions going through their 1900s or so.
Okay, that's cool. The cool thing about, and I mentioned this in our last interview, how you and I are very similar. I think we're kind of the same person in some ways, because you took, as an LDS person, you took the time to go to one of their church services.
Yeah.
And I made a point that the very first church in the Restoration that I visited was their church here north of Tampa. And so we've both been to service. So maybe just talk a little bit about your experience going to their service.
I'm not an expert from just one visit, but they were very welcoming. They knew we were from kind of the Salt Lake group, but we were local, and we went in, and they do what I call like a testimony meeting, where like it's an open mic to express your feelings about the Savior. And so they did an open mic and passed the mic around, and you could see that there were a lot of really sincere people that really wanted to do the best they could. They do have a sacrament service, and they, emphasize those that are members of the church can certainly do that. And so we watched a sacrament service, and the leader, I'm not sure if it's a pastor or what they call themselves, but the lead person did a like a 5-10 minute sermon or so. And you could just feel that it was pretty welcoming. They had a coffee hour and donuts and coffee hour afterwards as well. So it was kind of a munch and mingle afterwards too.
So I've been just 2 weeks ago, I went to my second service at a particular congregation in Cape Coral, Florida. Give a shout out to you guys. I know I got a lot of viewers now from the Church of Jesus Christ. Had a wonderful time with their service. And, it was just so cool. The first time I entered in and was felt, now they all knew I was coming. Many of them watched my videos already. And so I just had a wonderful experience. If you watch my interview with Josh Gailey, everybody, I think you'll know that the Spirit, you could sense that I felt the Spirit in that particular service. And the people are just absolutely awesome and welcoming, and they have welcomed me into their family. I feel like I'm kind of like an honorary member of that church in many ways.
So a shout out to also their hymn books.
Yes.
Half their hymns are, if you will, modern day gospel singing. And then it's interesting kind of going through the index and seeing some of the authors of the music. W.W. Phelps is an old church history name, and W.W. Phelps was the one that had some influence on the very first LDS or Joseph Smith hymn book with Emma Smith. And so they do have some W.W. Phelps Spirit of God Like a Fire, or half a dozen others. Is real fun to kind of see. Oh yeah, those are original hymns from original days. They still have those laced in around their hymns as well. So
yeah, it's everybody watched my interview with Becky Tarbuck, the Songs of Zion hymnal, one of the most remarkable hymnals ever produced. It's one of the coolest stories I've ever been able to tell, and it's an untold story. So the one thing, and let's emphasize, one of the things that I would describe the Church of Jesus Christ is they are a singing church. They love to sing, and it's fun to worship with them. So now, you got an edition you want to throw at me?
Yeah. So I did a review on this one, and this is kind of one of the family favorites. It's called the Street Legal Street Legal version of Mormon's book. And the guy was reading the Book of Mormon through, and while he was reading, he journaled and he rewrote the verses in his own in his own writing or so. And his introduction says, a street legal car is a souped up, not so much driven too often, but kind of souped up street legal version of a car that you can still drive, but it's still cool and not driven too often. And this street legal version, the same thing, it's souped up. And it just, the humor in it is so funny in terms of like, when Nephi is speaking, he says, how is it? Yeah, the God, like talking about when Nephi is trying to get the plates of brass, he says the guard saw all this and got scared himself. He hadn't found Lehi's headless corpse yet, but he's frozen, said, let's get out of here. And just fun stuff in terms of the street legal version of Mormon's book. So if you want to read a paraphrased edition of the Book of Mormon, the street legal version of Mormon's book was one of the family favorites.
Oh, that's awesome. And that was produced by a faithful member of your branch?
Yeah, actually a BYU professor of music. So
that's really cool. That's awesome, dude. Yeah, I remember you're doing your commentary. I'm probably your number one fan of your channel, by the way. So,
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
So I want to talk, this is really a cool edition that you did a review of. And of course, I had one of the people who was kind of in charge of the process of creating this particular book. It's called The Stick of Joseph in the Hand of Ephraim.
Yeah.
And you have the hardcover edition, and I've got the goatskin edition. Talk a little bit about that.
So the Stick of Joseph in the Hand of Ephraim is a third-party edition that's independent of Salt Lake. They tried to tailor the words in English, but all of the proper names go back to a Yiddish or a Hebraic version. And so they try to pattern a English text of the Book of Mormon into more of a Hebraic book for people who read in English but have Jewish traditions. can understand the Book of Mormon a little better. They don't call it the Book of Mormon, they call it the Stick of Joseph and the Hand of Ephraim. I think the Book of Mormon, probably to a Jewish background, would have a bias already. And so if they want to present this to somebody with a Hebrew background, Stick of Joseph and the Hand of Ephraim makes sense because they know the 12 tribes of Israel. And if the Jews are part of the 12 tribes of Israel, this was the writings of Joseph and Ephraim. So,
and just to give you an example, folks, like they took all the Book of Mormon names and gave them a Hebraic format. So Mosiah is Moshiah, is what it's called, and it's translated by Joseph ben Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph, son of Joseph. And let's see. Yeah, Zedekiah. Zedekiah, Judah. Let's see. Helaman was the most interesting one that I saw. Like, it was the Hebrew word of Helaman was Helam, CH and things like that. So
yeah, and it's weird because I asked them like Eter instead of Ether. I said,
yeah,
the Jaredites were not Hebrew, so why would they have used a Hebrew name for Ether? I just thought that was kind of an interesting choice they made.
But once again, they try to do as best as they can in terms of creating a Hebrew-styled Book of Mormon. But once again, the words are in English, but it's Hebraic-style English enough that somebody from a Jewish background would understand a little bit better.
So maybe we could just talk briefly about the history. Like one of the things when I talked with Adrian about this particular edition is we talked about how there actually technically isn't a Hebrew language version of the Book of Mormon that has been produced by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
They tried to, but the story and the history that most people know is that the church has the BYU Center in Jerusalem, which is the school in Jerusalem that's a branch of Brigham Young University. And in order for Brigham Young University to have a presence in the land of Israel, the church promised that they would not proselyte while any students of Brigham Young University would be there. So I have several friends that went to BYU Israel or BYU Jerusalem, and they had to kind of sign a disclosure agreement saying that they would not proselyte while they are in Israel or while they're at BYU. And so that also extends to, they don't have a Book of Mormon in Hebrew from the church specifically. Now, to let your viewers know, there was a Book of Mormon printed in Hebrew from the RLDS Church in the 1980s. And that's on my list to review pretty quickly or pretty soon.
Do you have a copy of that?
It's coming.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, it's coming. But once again, the RLDS Church did print a Hebrew Book of Mormon. I've also heard that there's a couple of individuals that did their best translation on a PDF file of a Hebrew Book of Mormon. I don't know the quality, and I think it hasn't caught on too much. So I think that the quality's subpar enough that I know that there's PDF versions of a Hebrew Book of Mormon, but there's not been a published one specifically from the Salt Lake Church. And it'll be interesting if a third party has a privilege of doing that sometime soon. They do, because they don't have an obligation of having BYU Jerusalem. So a third party can do it. So
yeah, so if there is a potential third party out there that could do it, that could
happen.
Could happen. That eventually will happen, obviously. And so let's see. I've got my Book of Mormons lined up, and I think I've covered most of them. Now, a couple things I wanted to say about a couple things I like to do is collect Book of Mormons that have writing in them, that are like personalized. So I'll get the missionary editions. This is actually a quad, right? This is a quad, and this was owned. Okay, cover the name. Owned by a young girl. I found it at a bookstore, and it tells a very unique story. And she tons of highlighting. It really touched me actually just reading this, because you can tell what happened. Did she find her man? Is she still in the church? Is she it's kind of, is she how's she doing? This is from I figure she was about 15 or 16 years old around 20 years ago when she was doing this. And I think it's important. I feel a real connection. If my green screen's messing up, folks, I'm sorry. I'm still learning how to do green screen. But it's a really, I feel like, somebody took the time to write something in the Book of Mormon. Maybe they were giving it to a family member or somebody at work. And I thought, okay, whenever I come across one of those, I'm buying it, because I think it adds to, it's part of the voices that I'm trying to assemble, to collect all the different voices of the restoration and kind of let them say their own story. And sometimes these Book of Mormons that have writing in them tell a story.
Yeah, half the time, some of them are what we call seminary editions, where they get one for their high school seminary and they print it, they write it up and things like that. And then unfortunately, maybe it gets discarded or put in a Goodwill pile or a thrift store pile, so that you get that. It's always interesting that every book probably has a story on where it was printed, whose hands it's touched, and things like that. So yeah, it's real fun to see it. Often they'll have in the front cover, a lot of times your missionary editions will have
I know underlined in the beginning.
Yeah, your missionary editions will have testimonies from the people who kind of do it and give them out, saying, here's a gift for you. I know it's important and I want you to read it. And so it's always kind of fun seeing different testimonials on a cover page of an edition of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, it's always just kind of cool, because people took the time to do it, and people are sincere in their beliefs and they want to share their gospel, their scriptures. And, as an evangelical, I totally relate to that, dude.
So in the future, one of my reviews is I have a 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon that was signed by Brigham Young's grandson.
Oh, wow.
And so I still have yet to do the research on how many grandchildren Brigham Young had. I would imagine it's a lot.
Oh, yeah. And find that out, because now I had Sandra Tanner on my program, and she's the great granddaughter of Brigham Young. I'd love to find out if she's in that line, which would be cool. And her grandfather or her great grandfather was Brigham Young Jr.
Okay.
And so that's her line that she's in. So yeah, kind of cool. So I want to, because I want to do a little bit of the commentaries, and then I'd like to, maybe you could give me a preview of what's coming up in some future episodes. I just wanted to ask you, do you have a Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon in your collection?
The Book of Mormon.
This was my very first book review. Christopher Thomas, the author from the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. If you don't have this in your collection, dude, you're missing out, dude.
I will read it. I'll get it.
Okay. So this, of course, folks, currently on Gospel Tangents, Christopher Thomas is being interviewed by Rick Bennett, and I brought them together. They didn't even know. Well, so it's pretty wild, dude. But and then I have, well, you bring out a commentary. Tell me a little bit about the one that has King Benjamin preaching on the cover that you showed earlier. Yeah, that one.
Scripture Study Made Simple. So all these made simple stuff, commentary, the Book of Mormon. And so once again, it's it's full volume Book of Mormon, and then a commentary around it, or various notes around specific reasons of that particular one. Okay. And so this one was done by Catherine Jenkins Gordon, and I think she's the leader or president of Covenant Communications. Covenant Communications. It's a publisher or independent publisher of all things Salt Lake LDS, and they feed into Deseret Book. So
okay, well, that's cool. That's really cool. I wanted to share one here. This is from the RLDS from the 1960s. It's called A Commentary of the Book of Mormon, and it's done by Chris B. Hartshorn. And from my understanding, I came across this at a book fair. I think the Printers World Book Fair around 2007, 2008 in Chicago. And it's like, for instance, they even have like their own proposed map, the Book of Mormon, and stuff like that. And so this was ubiquitous. Just in the 1960s and 70s, just about every RLDS household had this particular commentary. Are you familiar with this one?
Yeah, I've seen it before. It is with the RLDS church that they would do a commentary or a review book as well. So
yeah, kind of interesting. And then what do you got?
I did a presentation on this one, but this one was
Oh
really
yeah,
interesting. It was Hebrew Wars over Christ in
yeah.
America.
That's
And
what a title.
basically, that's the synopsis of the Book of Mormon without calling it the Book of Mormon. And so the story behind it is the text of the Book of Mormon itself is not in copyright format because it's public domain. Your 1830 text of the Book of Mormon has been around for a while. What is in copyright for the Salt Lake Church or any other church that publishes it is their introduction, their headings, their chapter headings, their footnotes or reference guides, things like that. And so this guy did interesting. He took the text of the Book of Mormon, actually the Salt Lake text of the Book of Mormon, took all of it out, all of the headings out, and just did the Book of Mormon. And Salt Lake got a hold of him or connected with him, and there was a copyright infringement lawsuit. And he had to agree that he had to put in a titling or something like that this book is not part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is not endorsed by the church. And if that was the case, then everyone was satisfied with it. So interesting kind of background on copyright infringement from Hebrew Wars over Christ in America. So, yeah.
Wow. And so basically they just kind of made an agreement, just put that in there and you can continue publishing it.
Correct. And most of the time, most all of your, even like your Salt Lake influenced, Book of Mormon made easier, things like that. They'll usually have a caption in the publication page saying, this book is sourced from a Salt Lake printing of the Book of Mormon, but is not endorsed by the church. And so they'll say walk a fine line, but they are very careful to say this is not a church sanctioned Book of Mormon from Salt Lake. Even though we reference a Salt Lake edition. So,
wow, that's pretty cool. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize, Jonathan Neville brought it up to me when I did an interview, says, the Book of Mormon doesn't belong to the church, it belongs to the world. And he said, and we pointed out how the Book of Mormon actually, this is the only time that a text came before the church. The Book of Mormon came first, and then the church came into being.
Yeah.
It's just a fascinating history to think of it that way, that, so often people associate the Book of Mormon just with the LDS branch. And let's tell you a little bit, like, for instance, I have my friend, Lynn Ridenhour. He wrote How to Share the Book of Mormon with a Baptist. This is actually a screenshot of his interview on BYU TV. And he talks at BYU, and he uses the Book of Mormon and preaches the gospel from the Book of Mormon. This copy was given to me by Boyd Tuttle of Digital Legend. He also publishes, we got to actually talk about one of their editions I forgot about it, a Book of Mormon I want to talk about. But basically, Lynn Ridenhour, he uses the Book of Mormon, and it's just kind of a cool story that, he's not a member, as a matter of fact, he's Southern Baptist, man. And so he was one of the speakers at the Book of Mormon rally. Do you have your annotated Book of Mormon? Yeah. Okay, let's grab that, because I got a copy from Boyd, but I had to leave it in Salt Lake City. Here, talk a little bit about that.
The annotated Book of Mormon is the significant person that people know of is a name by the name of Rod Meldrum.
Yep.
And in the 90s, 2000s, Rod Meldrum did some research regarding a new proposal of the Book of Mormon lands to be in the American Midwest, Ohio through Pennsylvania, through Palmyra, New York, through Illinois and Missouri, that kind of area, if you will. And so he proposed a Book of Mormon geography theory that was not Central America geography theory. And so the idea caught on, and quite a few people got with this idea, and the group created this annotated Book of Mormon. So half of it is the text of the Book of Mormon, and then other half is just pictures and reference guides and commentary regarding what's called the Heartland model of the Book of Mormon. And so it goes through, once again, a good version of the Book of Mormon, but also very good in terms of talking about the American colonial history, as well as artifacts and things like that from the American Midwest.
Yeah, and it's what also makes that particular edition unique is they also have a red letter edition, but they also have a blue letter edition. Talk a little bit about what the blue letters are about.
Blue letters are like angelic speaking.
Yeah.
So when either angels or the voice of the Spirit comes down to either prophets of the Book of Mormon, they do angelic speaking in blue, I believe, and kind of differentiate who's talking in with different colors.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's like, okay, you guys on your side, you came up with a real good one there. Got to give you props.
Yeah, a good tabletop edition. This one was printed well. I mean, the quality is print as well to kind of put on the tabletop. So
Yeah, so I had to leave my copy of that because I literally had a suitcase full of Book of Mormon or books, and I was like, Rick Bennett, can you please just send me this in the mail? It's actually supposed to arrive today. So unfortunately, it will be, I don't have it here, but it will be here later today. And because that's a big book, it's like 5 pounds, man.
yeah.
You know, actually, one thing I want to ask you is I'm kind of a fan of this guy named Steve Waldron, who has New Albany of Georgia Church. He's a oneness Pentecostal, and one of the things that was one of the inspirations of my channel. It's pretty low tech, but he just does all these book reviews. And he used to be a Bible salesman,
Okay.
and by the way, it's low tech because it has over 3 million views, by the way, folks. So, but basically, what he does is not only does he like talk about the particular, and he's a King James only guy too, just so you know, it's kind of interesting fellow. But he'll take a translation. He takes his Book of Mormons, Bibles, and he gets a ruler out, and he does the measurements of them. And then also does like gives you the type setting or the type that's used,
the
font
size,
size and measurements with a ruler. You know, that might be something you might want to look at doing.
Yeah. Actually, one person commented and that I still got to answer to him, like, what's the dimensions of a triple combination? And so, yeah, triple combination. I don't know. I've got to measure this line and this line and this line. So, yeah. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So I'll try to remember to leave a link for his New Albany, that Oneness Pentecostal guy, because it's kind of interesting what he's doing. He's doing something right. But and I'm not a Oneness Pentecostal, but I love those people. They're awesome too. So let's see. Okay. So basically, how often do you are you like about every 2 or 3 weeks you come up with a new video?
Yeah. Lately with school and holidays and work and things like that, it's been an average of a week and a half or so. I try to get one every week, and my ideal time is like Friday night to publish for Saturday and Sunday. So my goal is once a week, but it's kind of been pushed back around a week and a half to 2 weeks as well. So
okay, yeah, because I'm like, man, what's going on? He hasn't put out for a while.
Are you okay?
Yeah, exactly. Got to reach out to him, make sure he's fine. So one of the things I just wanted to ask you, if you could maybe just give us like a sneak peek of what's coming down the pike, what you're going to be reviewing and what you're considering reviewing. And by the way, folks, as he's getting the books, he's did a really cool series on illustrated Book of Mormons and graphic novel types, and that was really cool.
Yeah. So illustrating the Book of Mormon has been fun because the Book of Mormon stories in graphic view has been wonderful. One that is coming out is this one called Primary Scriptures.
Oh, cool.
Book of Mormon Stories for Kids. And they've got 2 out of 3 volumes printed. And the 3rd volume is they're trying to get out either by Christmas or after New Year's. And so I'll give a kind of synopsis that it's a real simplified version of the Book of Mormon. And it's a primary version. You know, here's the Liahona with Nephi and things like that. And so it's, once again, 3 volumes. They've printed 2 and their 3rd one's coming out. So as soon as I get the 3rd one, I'll do a review on that. And that's one of the last illustrated the Book of Mormons that I have, that one.
And who publishes that?
Oh, I should know this better. It's called Text Adapted by Jason Zipro and illustrated by Alicia Pace.
Oh, okay.
So,
cool.
Awesome. They'll have it out. They'll have it probably, hopefully in Deseret Book, but I think that there's an independent website as well. The last one, this one was interesting. I haven't done it yet, but it's called Eye Plates, and it's another comic book series, but it's rather than like large amount of Book of Mormon in a small amount of comic book. This comic book was like one specific story. So it's the story of Abinadi and King Noah. And they kind of jump around, and they started, I believe, with King Noah and Prophet Abinadi, and they have some kind of creative liberty in terms of backgrounds and stories and people talking and things like that. So it's called Eye Plates, and real interesting comic book. I need to do a little bit more research, but once again, that's coming down the pipe.
Wow.
For them. So I like it because, not say that they cherry pick, but they're doing a comic book with a very, very short story in the Book of Mormon, rather than trying to do a whole big, large section of the Book of Mormon in a comic book. So
Interesting. Very creative.
But one on my list as well as these volumes. And if you see it, Farms is Farms is Farms. It's an independent group, but highly influenced by Salt Lake, that they try to do ancient Mormon research foundation things. They partnered with Royal Skousen and others to do digital printings and analysis of the printer's manuscript and the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, or what pieces that we have. And this was actually before the Joseph Smith papers. So these were printed in 80s and 90s.
Okay, that's why they're still called Farms. Isn't Farms now, like, it has a different name now, doesn't it?
Yeah, so 2001 it was printed, and they're extremely rare, but they go through like all of the text of the printed manual. The printed manuscript is 2 volumes, and the original manuscript is 1 volume. And so they do in-depth analysis of the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript. And once again, this was before the Joseph Smith Papers website and before Skousen's earliest textbook of Mormon as well. So
really cool. Really cool.
They're rare. They're as well as they're so academic that only book collectors would want it for their bookshelves, and in-depth research. Not many like families would need or want this particular one.
Well, it's called Mormon Book Reviews, and I think a lot of my viewers would probably be interested in something like that. Now, a lot of these books, are you just finding them like at eBay, or where are you getting your stuff at?
Yeah, I'm going to say about 80% of the things that I get, I do research eBay to look at what's available or what's being sold. A lot of, a lot of bookstores in Utah will supplement their advertising to sell their books on eBay. For example, like Eborn Books, and a couple other booksellers in Utah will do eBay or other auction house websites to sell their books from their inventory.
So folks, just think about it. I have like probably one of the premier collectors of and experts of the Book of Mormon on my program.
You're too kind. You're too kind.
I didn't realize how much I knew about Mormonism until I started talking about Mormons and realized, oh, I know a lot about Mormonism. And you know a lot about the Book of Mormon, dude. And so I just want to ask you, first of all, folks, I'm going to leave another link to Book of Mormon editions on YouTube. And I just want to thank you so much, Robert, because it was really cool having you on the first time. I'm like one of your top fans of your channel. And I just want to ask you, like, do you have any final words for my audience, or any parting shots or whatever?
And we had mentioned it that, Salt Lake does the lion's share of the Book of Mormon printing, and they should, and they've done a great job in terms of flooding the earth with the Book of Mormon. And I don't want to make light of the time that I spent on the independent books to do more of a spotlight on the independent books, because truly Salt Lake has done an amazing job in terms of their missionary experience of the Book of Mormon. That being said, I recognize that Salt Lake does not have a monopoly on the Book of Mormon, that you can see it. There's quite a few publishers and independent people that love the Book of Mormon. And that's what I really find interesting, is that so many people do love the Book of Mormon enough to publish it in some way or another. And there's some value to that truly, as you had mentioned previously, why am I okay with, changes in the Book of Mormon, or how is this the most correct book on the earth? It's because if people draw closer to Heavenly Father, to the Savior, to what they should be doing in their life to make their lives better by reading the Book of Mormon, good for them and good for the publishers of the Book of Mormon to do so.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Robert from Book of Mormon Editions, I want to thank you so much for coming out to my program.
Yeah, thank you so much. It has been so fun, this journey, and I'm so glad that I've been doing it with you. And I'm glad to connect with you again, and I'll look forward to connecting again and again too.
I'll
So
tell you, there's a lot of people watching your channel that I talk to, and they're fans, and some of them are guests on my program, and they talk about you. So the word's getting around, dude. So I just want to remind my audience to like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification button to be informed when a new episode comes out. We're all going to get through this epidemic together. Things are starting to get better. Let's just follow the spirit, use common sense, and you all have yourself a great day.